What if the greatest predators in the universe weren't the ones with the sharpest claws or the deadliest weapons, but the ones who simply refuse to die? What if survival itself became humanity's most terrifying weapon? 500,000 years ago, Earth was nothing more than a primitive world filled with ape-like creatures who had barely learned to make fire. The Zephyrian Empire, rulers of 1,000 star systems, catalogued it as World 7834, no strategic value, and moved on to conquer more advanced civilizations. They never bothered to check what happened to those primitive apes. Now, as their vast fleet limps home after centuries of war with an enemy that nearly destroyed them, the Zephyrians seek refuge among the forgotten worlds of their ancient catalogue. Earth, that insignificant rock they dismissed so long ago, seems like the perfect place to rebuild their shattered empire. But, when their sensors pierce through Earth's atmosphere, what they find waiting for them defies every law of evolution, every principle of galactic development, and every nightmare they've ever had. The apes didn't just survive. They became something far worse than any predator the galaxy had ever known. They became human. And they've been waiting. Commander Zexhai stood before the massive viewing port of the Eternal Dominion, watching the blue and green marble that hung in the void ahead grow larger with each passing hour. His 4 eyes, each capable of seeing across 17 different light spectrums, studied the world with growing confusion. According to the ancient archives, this planet should have been nothing more than another dead rock by now, its primitive inhabitants long since extinct from any number of natural disasters. Yet the readings told a different story entirely. Commander, his aide, Lieutenant Mordak, approached with obvious hesitation. The younger Zephyrian's scales rippled with anxiety colors that he couldn't quite suppress. The long-range scanners are detecting something unusual about the third planet. Zexhai's primary eyes remained fixed on the growing world while his secondary pair swiveled to regard his subordinate. Define unusual, Lieutenant. Sir, the electromagnetic signature suggests advanced civilization. Very advanced. The energy readings are unlike anything in our databases, and the orbital structures. Mordak paused, his membrane ears fluttering with uncertainty. Sir, there are artificial constructs in orbit that dwarf our largest battle stations. The commander's crest flared involuntarily before he forced it back down. Such displays of emotion were beneath an officer of his rank. He had survived the Void Wars, commanded fleets against the nightmare creatures from the Andromeda Spiral, and watched entire solar systems burn under his command. Nothing should surprise him anymore. Show me the detailed scans, he ordered, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect across 3 galactic sectors. The bridge's main holographic display shimmered to life, revealing a 3-dimensional model of the Sol system. What they saw there made every Zephyrian present fall silent. The third planet was surrounded by an intricate network of space stations, orbital platforms, and structures that defied immediate classification. Massive ring-like constructs encircled the planet at various altitudes, while geometric patterns of smaller installations formed complex grids throughout near-Earth space. But it was the readings from the planet's surface that truly disturbed them. The entire landmass showed signs of extensive modification. Geometric patterns stretched across continents, energy signatures indicated fusion reactors by the thousands, and atmospheric analysis revealed an oxygen-nitrogen mix maintained at artificially optimal levels. This is impossible, whispered Science Officer Theluna, her tentacles writhing in agitation. According to our records, this world was inhabited by primitive bipedal creatures. Tool users, yes, but barely beyond the Stone Age level of development. The last survey was conducted only. She paused to check her calculations, 500,000 standard years ago. No species develops this rapidly. Zexhai studied the readings more carefully. His military mind, honed by centuries of warfare, began to identify defensive patterns in the orbital construction. Those weren't random space stations. They were fortress platforms, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across all approach vectors. The ring structures weren't just impressive engineering marvels, they were weapons platforms capable of directing devastating firepower at any point in the inner system. Navigator, he called to the bridge crew member responsible for their course plotting. How quickly can we reverse our trajectory and leave this system? Sir? Navigator Kethmore's compound eyes blinked in surprise. We've already committed significant fuel resources to deceleration. Reversing course now would leave us dangerously low on reaction mass, and we still have 17 ships in need of critical repairs. Zexhi's jaw plates ground together audibly. The Eternal Fleet was limping home from their disastrous encounter with the Devourers, those terrifying entities that consumed entire worlds and left nothing but empty space in their wake. Half their ships were barely holding together, their crews exhausted from years of running battles across the galaxy's edge. They needed a safe harbor, a place to regroup and rebuild. But something about this world felt wrong. Very wrong. "Sir," Communications Officer Yeltash spoke up from her station, her voice tight with strain, "we're receiving a transmission from the planet." "What kind of transmission?" Zexhi demanded. It's an old galactic standard, sir. The diplomatic frequency. Perfect pronunciation and grammar." The bridge fell silent. Old Galactic Standard was the language of the first interstellar empire, established over 3 million years ago. It was still used for formal diplomatic communications between ancient civilizations, but, for a primitive world to know, it was utterly impossible. "Put it through," Zexhi ordered, though every instinct screamed at him to order immediate withdrawal. The voice that filled the bridge was calm, pleasant, and spoke in the refined accent of the highest diplomatic circles. But underneath that cultured tone was something else, something that made Zexhi's combat-hardened nerves tighten with primal fear. "Greetings, vessels of the Zephyrian Empire. This is Earth Defense Command. We have been monitoring your approach for the past 14 hours. Your fleet configuration and damage patterns suggest you are refugees from the Devourer conflict in the Outer Spiral Arm." Zexhi exchanged glances with his senior staff. How could they possibly know about the Devourers? That threat had been contained in regions far from any known spacefaring civilization. The voice continued, still maddeningly calm and polite. "We extend an invitation for diplomatic contact. Please reduce your velocity to 1/10 current speed and maintain your present course. You will be met by escort vessels once you reach the edge of our orbital defensive perimeter." "Defensive perimeter?" Lieutenant Mordak whispered. "Sir, according to our scans, their defensive perimeter extends from the planet's surface to nearly the orbit of their fourth world. That's millions of cubic kilometers of monitored space." Zexhi's secondary hearts began beating faster. The implications were staggering. To maintain active sensor coverage across such a vast area required technology and energy resources that even the Zephyrian Empire at its height couldn't have managed. "Open a response channel," he ordered finally. "Channel open, sir." Zexhi drew himself up to his full height, allowing his crest to flare in the traditional display of Zephyrian authority. "This is Commander Zexhi of the Imperial Battlecruiser Eternal Dominion, speaking for the 47th Emergency Fleet of the Zephyrian Empire. We require emergency sanctuary for fleet repairs and medical assistance for our wounded. We invoke the ancient rights of interstellar aid as recognized by the Galactic Concordat." The response came back almost instantly, as if they had anticipated his exact words. "Your request for sanctuary is acknowledged, Commander Zexhi. However, before we can process your application for temporary territorial access, we must conduct a formal diplomatic exchange. This is standard protocol for all first contact situations with previously unencountered civilizations." Previously unencountered? Zexhi's crest flattened against his skull. They were treating the Zephyrian Empire, rulers of over 1,000 worlds, as if they were some unknown species stumbling into space for the first time. "We are not an unencountered civilization," he replied, struggling to keep his voice level. "The Zephyrian Empire has maintained interstellar commerce and diplomacy for over 2 million standard years. We surveyed this system in the distant past and found only primitive life forms." There was a pause. When the voice returned, it carried a subtle shift in tone that made Zexhi's warrior instincts scream danger. "Ah yes, we have records of that survey in our historical databases. Conducted approximately 500,000 years ago by survey vessel designation ZE-7834. The survey team noted bipedal tool users with developing agriculture and basic metallurgy. They classified Earth as no strategic value and departed after a 17-hour observation period." Zexhi felt the temperature in his body drop. They had records of a survey that predated their current civilization by hundreds of millennia. Records that should have been lost to time, forgotten in databases that no longer existed. How do you possess such ancient information? He asked, though he was beginning to suspect he wouldn't like the answer. We keep very good records, Commander. Very comprehensive records. Now, if you would please reduce velocity as requested, we can begin the formal diplomatic process. Our escort vessels are launching now. On the tactical display, new contacts began appearing. Ships rising from the planet's orbital structures, accelerating toward the Zephyrian fleet with impossible speed. Zexhi's tactical officer began reading off specifications that made no sense. Commander, the approaching vessels are accelerating at over 400 gravities with no apparent reaction mass expenditure. Their energy signatures are, sir, they're generating more power than our entire fleet combined, and these appear to be light escort craft. Zexhi watched the approaching vessels with the eye of a military professional. Their design was sleek, organic-looking, and somehow beautiful in a way that made them seem more grown than built. But, beneath that aesthetic appeal, he could see the unmistakable hallmarks of devastating military capability. How many ships are approaching? He asked quietly. Sensors detect 47 vessels, sir. Exact match for our fleet composition. The message was clear. These beings, these humans, if that's what they called themselves, had sent exactly enough ships to match his fleet 1-to-1. It was either a gesture of respect for numerical parity, or a subtle threat that they could match his forces without effort. As the distance closed, Zexhi got his first clear view of the escort vessels. They were smaller than his battlecruisers, more elegant, but they moved with the precise coordination of a school of predatory fish. And, now that he could see them clearly, he noticed something that made his blood chill. The hulls weren't purely metallic. There were organic components, sections that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, and areas that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. These weren't just ships, they were hybrid constructs of technology and biology working in perfect harmony. Sir, his weapons officer called out in a strangled voice, they're scanning us. The scanning beams are penetrating our shields like they don't exist and mapping our internal structure down to the molecular level. Defensive Pattern 7, Zexhi ordered instinctively. Raise all shields and arm weapons systems. Commander, the pleasant voice returned, now carrying a subtle note of disappointment, we detect weapons powering up aboard your vessels. This is unnecessary. We understand you are refugees in need of assistance, and we have no hostile intentions. However, we must ask that you power down all weapons systems while within our defensive perimeter. This is for everyone's safety. Everyone's safety? Zexhi's secondary arms clenched into fists. You're scanning our ships without permission and surrounding us with unknown vessels, and you speak of safety? Commander, we understand your caution. But, please consider your situation objectively. Your fleet consists of 17 damaged warships, several critically so. Your fuel reserves are depleted, your crews are exhausted, and you are hundreds of light years from the nearest Zephyrian outpost. We are offering assistance. Surely there is no logical benefit to beginning our relationship with hostilities? Zexhi realized with growing horror that they were right. His fleet was in no condition to fight anyone, let alone beings who casually deployed technology that seemed to violate several laws of physics. But, more than that, he was beginning to understand that this wasn't really a negotiation at all. It was an interview. These humans were evaluating him and his people, deciding whether they were worthy of the help they desperately needed. The power dynamic he had assumed, that of a superior civilization graciously accepting aid from primitive locals, had been completely inverted. He was the primitive now. Very well, he said finally, each word tasting like defeat. We will comply with your requests. All weapons systems are being powered down. Excellent. Now, Commander, our escort vessels will guide you to Orbital Platform 7, where we can begin the diplomatic process properly. Please follow their lead and do not deviate from the prescribed course. Earth's orbital defenses are quite robust, and we would hate for there to be any unfortunate accidents. As the human escort vessels moved into formation around his fleet, Zexhi couldn't shake the feeling that he had just led his people into something far more dangerous than the devourers they had fled from. At least with the devourers, you knew where you stood. They were a clear and obvious threat, entities of pure destruction that consumed everything in their path. But these humans, with their polite voices and impossible technology, with their perfect knowledge of his people's ancient past and their casual display of overwhelming power, they were something far more terrifying. They were the unknown. Orbital Platform 7 hung in space like a crystalline flower, its transparent surfaces gleaming with internal lights that pulsed in patterns too complex for Zephyrian eyes to follow comfortably. As Commander Zexhi's shuttle approached the docking bay, he found himself struggling to understand the engineering principles behind the structure. The platform was clearly artificial, but it seemed to grow from some central point rather than being assembled from component parts. Commander, his aide Mordak spoke quietly from the seat beside him, our science teams have been analyzing the platform's construction. The materials appear to be some form of crystal and carbon composite, but the molecular structure is unlike anything in our databases. It's as if they've learned to grow diamond into specific architectural shapes. Zexhi nodded absently, his attention focused on the docking bay ahead. The opening was perfectly sized for their shuttle, as if it had been grown specifically for this purpose. As they passed through the atmospheric containment field, he noted that the internal atmosphere was automatically adjusted to Zephyrian physiological requirements. Somehow, these humans had scanned their shuttle and immediately adapted their environment accordingly. The reception committee waiting for them was small but impressive in ways that made Zexhi's military instincts twitch with unease. 3 humans stood at the center of the docking bay, flanked by what appeared to be honor guards, though their equipment was so far beyond anything the Zephyrian commander recognized that he couldn't be certain of their function. The central figure stepped forward as Zexhi emerged from the shuttle. She was tall for a human, with dark skin and silver hair that seemed to move in defiance of the station's artificial gravity. Her clothing appeared to be made from some form of adaptive fabric that shifted color and texture subtly as she moved, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through pretense. Commander Zexhi, she said, extending her hand in what he recognized as a human greeting gesture, I am Director Sarah Chen, Earth's primary diplomatic liaison for first contact situations. Welcome to our system. Zexhi performed the traditional Zephyrian greeting, touching his crest with his primary hand while extending his secondary arms. The human's response was flawless, she mirrored his gesture exactly, despite the obvious anatomical differences. You know our customs, he observed, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Director Chen smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and slightly predatory. We've had considerable time to study the various species that have passed through our region of space. The Zephyrian Empire has a particularly rich cultural heritage. Passed through? Zexhi's crest flattened slightly. You speak as if many others have come here. Oh, they have. Over the past several millennia, we've hosted representatives from over 300 different spacefaring civilizations. Refugees, explorers, traders, scientists, even a few conquerors. Her smile remained pleasant, but something in her tone suggested that the conquerors had not fared well. As they walked through the station's corridors, Zexhi found himself increasingly disturbed by what he saw. The walls themselves seemed alive, surfaces that shifted and flowed like liquid metal but maintained perfect structural integrity. Holographic displays appeared in midair without any visible projection equipment, showing what appeared to be real-time views of distant star systems. Your technology, he began carefully, it's unlike anything in our databases. We've had a very long time to develop it, Director Chen replied. Human civilization has been space-capable for approximately 450,000 years. We've learned much in that time. Zexhi stopped walking. That's impossible. No species develops space travel that rapidly from a primitive state. Director Chen turned to face him, and, for the first time, her pleasant expression slipped slightly. What replaced it was something ancient and tired, the look of someone who had explained this many times before. Commander, what do you know about human evolution? About how our species developed from those primitive tool users your people observed? Basic xenobiology, Zexhi replied carefully. Evolution is a slow process. It takes millions of years for significant changes to occur naturally. Naturally, yes. But human evolution hasn't been entirely natural for quite some time. She led them into a vast chamber whose walls displayed what appeared to be historical records, images, videos, and data streams that told a story spanning hundreds of millennia. Zexhi found himself staring at the progression of human development, watching as the primitive creatures his people had dismissed gradually transformed into something unprecedented. "We call it the Great Acceleration," Director Chen explained, her voice taking on the tone of someone reciting a well-rehearsed explanation. "It began approximately 50,000 years after your people's survey. A small group of humans made a discovery that changed everything." The display showed archaeological sites, ancient ruins that predated human civilization by millions of years. Crystalline structures buried deep in the earth, artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "We found the remnants of a previous interstellar civilization. One that had visited Earth long before even your empire existed. Most of their technology was too damaged to be useful, but we found their biological enhancement laboratories intact." Zexai felt his secondary heart skip a beat. Enhancement laboratories? They had been studying Earth's biosphere, cataloging species for potential uplift projects. "When their civilization fell, we still don't know exactly what happened to them. They left behind incomplete experiments. Templates for accelerated evolution. Genetic modification protocols that could compress millions of years of development into centuries." The historical display showed early humans working with crystalline interfaces, their bodies gradually changing over generations. Enhanced intelligence, improved physical capabilities, extended lifespans. But, more than that, they developed an almost supernatural ability to adapt to new environments and technologies. "We didn't just use their enhancement protocols," Director Chen continued. "We improved upon them. Each generation became more capable than the last, not just individually, but as a collective intelligence. We learned to think on longer timescales, to plan for futures that span millennia rather than mere decades." Zexai studied the progression of human technology displayed on the walls around them. The advancement was indeed impossible by normal standards, from crude stone tools to sophisticated genetic engineering in less time than it took most species to develop agriculture. "But, this level of advancement," he protested, "it should have made you a galactic power centuries ago. Why has no one encountered you before?" Director Chen's smile returned, but now it carried implications that made Zexai's warrior instincts scream warnings. "Because we chose not to be encountered, Commander. We learned very early that the galaxy is a dangerous place, filled with species that view other intelligent life as either resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. We decided it would be safer to watch and learn before making ourselves known." "Watch and learn?" Zexai's crest began to rise involuntarily. "You've been observing other civilizations without their knowledge?" "For over 400,000 years, yes. We've studied the rise and fall of empires, the development of technologies, the patterns of interstellar warfare. We've watched species like yours expand across the galaxy, conquering worlds and enslaving populations. We've seen the devourers consume entire sectors. We've observed the birth and death of 1,000 different civilizations." The implications hit Zexai like a physical blow. "You knew about the devourers before they attacked us. We've been monitoring their expansion for the past 12,000 years. We attempted to warn several civilizations in their path, but our communications were either ignored or dismissed as elaborate hoaxes. The Zephyrian High Command received 17 separate warnings about the Devourer threat. All were filed under unsubstantiated alien communications and forgotten." Zexai's mind reeled. The war against the Devourers had cost the Zephyrian Empire over half its territory and billions of lives. If they had heeded those warnings, prepared for the threat, countless worlds might have been saved. "Why reveal yourselves now?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because the old order is ending, Commander. The great galactic empires are falling, consumed by threats they cannot understand or adapt to quickly enough. The age of conquest and expansion through force is coming to an end. A new paradigm is emerging." Director Chin gestured to another section of the chamber, where holographic displays showed current galactic politics. Map after map revealed the truth that Zexai had been trying to deny: the Zephyrian Empire was finished. Their core worlds were under siege, their fleets scattered, their government in exile. But they weren't alone. A dozen other major civilizations were in similar states of collapse. The crystalline hegemony, the void wanderers, the stellar communion, all reduced to refugee fleets or isolated enclaves, trying desperately to survive in a galaxy that had become actively hostile to their existence. And what is this new paradigm? Zexai asked, though he was beginning to understand. Cooperation. Adaptation. Symbiosis rather than domination. Director Chen's expression became serious. Humanity is offering something that has never existed in galactic history, genuine sanctuary. Not as subjects or conquered peoples, but as partners in a new kind of civilization. What's the price? Zexai asked bluntly. In his experience, nothing of value came without cost. Integration, she replied simply. Not assimilation, you would retain your cultural identity, your autonomy, your dignity. But you would become part of something larger. A collective of species working together rather than competing for resources and territory. The displays around them shifted to show what appeared to be thriving worlds, not just human worlds, but planets inhabited by dozens of different species. Cities that blended architectural styles from across the galaxy, research stations where beings with radically different biologies worked side by side, fleets of ships that combined technologies from multiple civilizations. You've done this before, Zexai realized. Those 300 civilizations you mentioned, they weren't just visitors. Many of them chose to stay. The Kalari brought their mastery of exotic matter physics. The Zhengti contributed their biological enhancement expertise. The Void Singers shared their understanding of dimensional manipulation. Each species that joins us makes the whole stronger. And those who refuse? Director Chen's expression didn't change, but something in the air seemed to grow colder. Are free to leave, of course. We provide them with the resources they need to establish themselves elsewhere in the galaxy. Many have founded successful colonies in distant sectors. Zexai studied her carefully. But you don't recommend refusing. I recommend making informed decisions, Commander. Your fleet represents the last organized military force of one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations. You carry within you the genetic legacy of billions of Zephyrians, the accumulated knowledge of 2 million years of interstellar culture. That heritage is precious beyond measure. She paused, letting the implications sink in. But heritage only has value if there are people alive to preserve it. Your current trajectory leads to extinction within 2 generations, 3 at most. Your fuel reserves are depleted, your ships are failing, and there are no Zephyrian worlds left that can support a population of your size. The mathematical certainty of her assessment hit him like a weapon. She was right, and they both knew it. His people were dying, not just individually but as a species. Without intervention, the Zephyrian Empire would become nothing more than a footnote in galactic history. You've calculated all of this, he said. It wasn't a question. We've had to. It's the only way to offer meaningful assistance. We don't make grand gestures or empty promises, Commander. We provide practical solutions to real problems. Director Chen led him to a final display, this one showing detailed projections of Zephyrian integration into human space. Population distributions, resource allocations, technological development programs, cultural preservation initiatives. It was comprehensive to a degree that suggested years of preparation. How long have you been planning this? He asked. Since we first detected your fleet entering this sector 18 months ago. We've been monitoring the Devourer conflict since its beginning, tracking refugee movements, calculating survival probabilities for various civilizations. When we determined that the Zephyrian Empire would likely collapse within the next decade, we began preparing integration protocols. The casual admission that they had been watching his people's destruction with the detachment of scientific observers should have angered him. Instead, Zexai found himself oddly grateful for their thorough preparation. At least someone had been planning for his people's survival, even if his own government had been too proud to consider the possibility of defeat. I need to consult with my officers, he said finally. Of course. You'll want to thoroughly examine our proposals and discuss the implications with your people. We've prepared detailed briefings on all aspects of the integration process, as well as testimonials from representatives of other species who have joined us. As Director Chen led him back toward the docking bay, Zexai found himself overwhelmed by the scope of what he had learned. Humanity wasn't just another spacefaring civilization, they were something entirely new in galactic history. A species that had learned to adapt and evolve at a pace that defied conventional understanding, and who offered genuine alternatives to the endless cycle of conquest and collapse that had defined interstellar politics for millions of years. But, beneath his growing hope was a nagging certainty that there was more to this story. No species became this advanced, this prepared, this thoroughly knowledgeable about galactic affairs without costs and complications that weren't immediately apparent. As his shuttle departed the platform, heading back toward his fleet, Zexai realized that he was facing the most important decision in Zephyrian history. The choice between certain extinction and uncertain transformation into something his people had never been before. The only question was whether he could convince his officers that evolution was preferable to extinction, even if that evolution came at the hands of beings who might be more alien than they appeared. The emergency council meeting aboard the Eternal Dominion had been raging for 6 hours. Commander Zexai sat at the head of the holographic conference table, listening to his senior officers tear apart every aspect of the human proposal with the systematic thoroughness that had once made the Zephyrian military the most feared force in 3 galactic sectors. "It's a trap," declared Admiral Kryven, commander of the heavy cruiser Stellar Wrath. Her scars from the Devourer Wars crisscrossed her face like a map of battles fought and barely won. No species becomes this powerful, this knowledgeable about galactic affairs, without expansionist intentions. They're offering us survival in exchange for becoming their vassals. Captain Felross of the research vessel Eternal Quest disagreed vehemently. The technological demonstrations alone prove they have nothing to gain from deception. They could have destroyed our entire fleet before we even entered their system. The energy expenditure required to maintain those orbital platforms exceeds our total industrial capacity by orders of magnitude. Which makes them even more dangerous, countered Colonel Vextar, head of the fleet's military intelligence division. His multiple eyes swiveled independently as he accessed data streams from his neural implants. "I've been analyzing their historical claims, and the numbers don't add up. No species evolves technologically at the rate they describe without significant external intervention. Either they're lying about their development timeline, or they've made contact with forces that represent an existential threat to galactic civilization." Science Officer Theluna raised a tentacled appendage. "I've been reviewing the biological data they shared about their enhancement programs. The genetic modifications they describe should be impossible to implement without causing catastrophic cellular breakdown within 3 generations. Yet they claim to have been using these techniques for hundreds of millennia. Unless," Captain Morseth of the Engineering Corps interjected, "they're not actually the same species that our ancestors surveyed. What if these humans are something else entirely, using the identity of extinct primitives to mask their true nature?" Zexai studied the faces around the table, seeing his own doubts reflected in their expressions. Each of his officers was voicing concerns that he himself had been wrestling with since leaving the orbital platform. The human story was simultaneously too fantastic to believe and too thoroughly documented to dismiss. "What about the other species they claim to have integrated?" he asked. "Have we been able to verify any of their testimonials?" Colonel Vextar activated a holographic display showing galactic political maps spanning the past several millennia. "This is where things become interesting. According to our historical records, at least 40 of the species they mentioned were reported as extinct due to various calamities. Wars, plagues, stellar phenomena all presumably wiped them out. But the timeline suggests they might have simply disappeared from galactic affairs instead." Admiral Kryven leaned forward, her combat instincts engaged. "Disappeared how?" "No distress signals, no final transmissions, no debris fields where their worlds should be. They simply stopped communicating with the outside galaxy and were eventually presumed dead." "But what if they had actually chosen isolation instead?" Captain Felross pulled up additional data. "I've been examining the technological signatures of their escort vessels. While the overall design is unique, I'm detecting component technologies that match historical records of at least 12 different species. It's as if they've integrated not just populations, but entire technological traditions." The implications hung heavy in the conference room's recycled air. If the humans were telling the truth, they weren't just offering sanctuary, they were offering genuine technological and cultural synthesis on a scale never before achieved in galactic history. "There's something else," Theluna added reluctantly. "I've been analyzing the environmental data from their space stations. The atmospheric composition, gravity fields, and radiation levels are precisely calibrated for Zephyrian physiology. Not approximately calibrated, perfectly calibrated. They understood our biological requirements better than some of our own medical databases. Admiral Criven's crest flattened against her skull. How is that possible? Our last contact with this system was 500,000 years ago, and our survey team never shared detailed biological data. Unless, Colonel Vexstar said quietly, they've been monitoring us far longer than they've admitted. The possibility sent a chill through the assembled officers. The idea that humanity had been observing Zephyrian civilization for centuries or millennia, learning their secrets, studying their weaknesses, was deeply unsettling. Yet it also suggested a level of patient long-term planning that was almost incomprehensible. Commander Zexhai activated his personal communication array. "Put me through to Director Chen." The response came almost instantly, as if the humans had been waiting for his call. Director Chen's image appeared on the conference room's main display, her expression calm and expectant. "Commander Zexhai, I trust your discussions have been productive?" "We have questions," Zexhai said bluntly. "Serious questions about the nature of your civilization and your true intentions." "Of course you do. Please, ask whatever you need to know." Admiral Criven spoke first. "You claim to have integrated hundreds of species over the millennia, yet galactic records show many of those species as extinct. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Director Chen's expression didn't change, but she paused for a moment as if accessing information. "Admiral, may I ask what you would do if your civilization faced an extinction-level threat that could only be survived by abandoning everything you had built and starting over in complete isolation?" "I would fight," Criven replied immediately. "Even if fighting guaranteed extinction, while retreat offered survival?" "A warrior does not retreat from duty." "And yet here you are, Admiral, in retreat from the devourers who consumed your empire." Chen's voice remained gentle, but the words hit like physical blows. "The species you mentioned chose survival over heroic extinction. They faked their own destruction and joined us in isolation, contributing to a collective civilization that could protect them better than their individual empires ever could." Colonel Vexstar leaned forward. "How long have you been monitoring our civilization?" "Actively?" "Since your first expansion beyond your home system, approximately 2.3 million years ago. We've maintained observation posts in most major galactic sectors for the past 500,000 years." The casual admission that humanity had been watching galactic civilization for longer than most empires had existed was staggering. Science Officer Theluna spoke up next. "Your biological enhancement technologies, they violate several fundamental principles of genetic stability. How have you managed to avoid evolutionary collapse?" Director Chen smiled, and, for the first time, Zexhai detected something approaching genuine humor in her expression. "By accepting that evolution and technology don't have to be separate processes. We don't just modify our genetics, we integrate biological and technological systems at the cellular level. What you see as humans are actually hybrid beings, part organic, part synthetic, part something entirely new." The honesty of the admission was almost more disturbing than any deception would have been. Captain Felross asked the question that Zexhai had been dreading. "What do you actually want from us? What does humanity gain from this arrangement?" "Perspective," Chen replied immediately. "Each species that joins us brings unique viewpoints, technologies, and cultural insights. The Zephyrian Empire has 2 million years of accumulated knowledge about interstellar governance, military strategy, and technological development. That knowledge is invaluable for building sustainable galactic civilization." "But you could simply extract that knowledge without our consent," Captain Morseth pointed out. "Your technological capabilities clearly exceed ours by considerable margins." "We could," Chen agreed. "But forced extraction produces incomplete results. Cultural knowledge isn't just data, it's living wisdom that requires willing participation to transfer effectively. Besides, we've learned that diversity of thought is essential for long-term survival. Homogeneous civilizations eventually stagnate and collapse, no matter how advanced they become." Admiral Criven wasn't satisfied. "You speak of voluntary integration, but what happens to those who refuse?" What happens to those who change their minds after joining? For the first time, Director Chen's pleasant expression shifted slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Those who refuse are free to leave, as I mentioned. We provide them with resources and assist them in finding suitable territories elsewhere. However, we also ensure that they cannot threaten the security of our collective civilization. Ensure how? Zexai asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Memory modification, Chen replied matter-of-factly. Anyone who leaves has all knowledge of our capabilities, locations, and technologies removed. They retain their personal memories and cultural heritage, but they cannot share information that might lead hostile forces to our territories. The conference room fell silent. The implications were clear: joining humanity was a one-way decision. Once you knew their secrets, you could never truly leave. And those who changed their minds after integration are counseled extensively to understand why they're having difficulties adapting. In most cases, we can address their concerns through modified integration protocols or cultural accommodation programs. In the rare instances where this isn't possible. Chen paused. They are relocated to special communities where they can live comfortably while maintaining minimal contact with sensitive information. Colonel Vexstar translated immediately. Comfortable prisons. Comfortable communities, Chen corrected. With full access to recreational facilities, cultural activities, and social interactions. They simply cannot access or share certain categories of information. Zexai realized that the humans' offer wasn't quite as generous as it had initially appeared. It was more sophisticated than simple conquest, but it was still a form of control that allowed for no real alternative once accepted. You're asking us to trust you with our entire civilization's future based on promises that we cannot verify, he said finally. Yes, Chen replied simply. That's exactly what I'm asking. Because the alternative is extinction within 2 generations, and you know it. The brutal honesty of her statement silenced all objections. She was right, and everyone in the conference room knew it. The Zephyrian Empire was dying, its resources depleted, its territory lost, its people scattered across refugee fleets that could not sustain themselves indefinitely. How long do we have to decide? Zexai asked. As long as you need, Chen replied. Though I should mention that our intelligence networks indicate 3 Devourer scout ships have entered this sector. They're approximately 6 months behind you and moving in this direction. We can protect you from them, but only if you're formally integrated into our collective defense network. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and everyone in the room understood the implication. The humans knew about the pursuing Devourers because they had been monitoring the situation all along. This entire scenario, the Zephyrian fleet's arrival, the pursuit by hostile forces, the need for immediate decision-making had been anticipated and planned for. You orchestrated this, Admiral Kryven accused. We prepared for this, Chen corrected. There's a significant difference. We didn't cause the Devourer expansion or the fall of your empire. But we did calculate the probability that surviving Zephyrian forces would eventually reach this sector, and we prepared accordingly. Including preparing our choices so that integration appears to be the only viable option? Chen's smile returned, but now it carried undertones that made Zexai's combat instincts twitch. Admiral, choice is always an illusion when dealing with extinction-level scenarios. We're simply offering you better illusions than the alternatives. As the communication link closed, Zexai looked around the table at his senior officers. Each face reflected the same grim realization that had been growing in his own mind: they weren't negotiating with humans at all. They were negotiating with something that had once been human but had evolved into something entirely unprecedented in galactic history. A collective intelligence that thought in geological timescales, planned for contingencies across millennia, and offered survival at the cost of fundamental transformation. The question was no longer whether they could trust the humans. The question was whether they could afford not to, given that extinction was the only alternative. And, as if reading his thoughts, Admiral Kryven spoke the words that had been echoing in every mind around the table: what if survival isn't worth the price they're asking? It was a question that Zexai knew would haunt him regardless of what decision he ultimately made. Some prices were too high to pay, even for survival. But others were too high not to pay, especially when the alternative was the complete extinction of everything his people had ever been or could ever become. 3 days after the initial council meeting, Commander Zexai found himself aboard another human facility, this one a massive research station that existed partially in normal space and partially in what the humans called dimensional substrate layers. The sensation of moving through spaces that shouldn't exist according to known physics was deeply unsettling, but not nearly as disturbing as what the humans were showing him. "This is the Kalari Integration Facility," explained Dr. James Morrison, a human scientist whose eyes held the same ancient quality as Director Chen's. "The Kalari were the first major civilization to join our collective, approximately 200,000 years ago." Zexai studied the beings moving through the research complex. They were clearly not human, but neither were they entirely Kalari as his historical databases described that species. They were taller, more graceful, with elongated craniums that suggested enhanced neural capacity. But most disturbing were their eyes. They held the same timeless quality as the humans, suggesting a shared consciousness that transcended individual identity. "They don't look like the Kalari in our records," observed Captain Felross, who had accompanied Zexai on this inspection tour. "Because they're not," Dr. Morrison replied matter-of-factly. "They're what the Kalari became after integration. Enhanced, optimized, freed from the biological limitations that would have led to their extinction." "Freed or transformed into something else entirely?" Zexai asked pointedly. Dr. Morrison paused at a viewing platform that overlooked a vast chamber where hundreds of beings from dozens of different species worked in perfect harmony. Zephyrians would have recognized some of them, crystalline hegemony members, void wanderers, even a few species that were supposed to have been extinct for millennia. "Commander, let me ask you something. Are you the same being you were when you hatched from your egg? Same thoughts, same knowledge, same capabilities?" "Of course not. Growth and development are natural processes." "Exactly. What we offer is simply accelerated, guided development. Instead of leaving biological and cultural evolution to random chance, we actively direct it toward optimal outcomes." Captain Felross studied the working beings below. They all move with the same patterns, the same efficiency. "Where is their individual identity?" "Enhanced, not erased," Morrison replied. "Watch more carefully." As they observed, subtle differences became apparent. Each being worked with techniques that reflected their species' traditional approaches, but refined and perfected beyond anything their ancestors could have achieved. Crystalline hegemony members grew complex geometric structures, but these structures incorporated design principles from dozens of other civilizations. Void wanderers manipulated exotic matter, but their techniques had been enhanced with technologies that their original culture had never dreamed possible. They retain their cultural identities, Morrison explained, but they've also gained access to the accumulated knowledge and capabilities of every other integrated species. A Kalari engineer doesn't just think like a Kalari, they can think like a Kalari, a human, a crystalline, or any combination thereof, depending on what the situation requires. Multiple personality syndrome, Felross diagnosed with clinical precision. Multiple capability syndrome, Morrison corrected. They haven't lost their original personalities. They've gained access to additional ones. Zexai found the distinction terrifying rather than reassuring. And if they don't want these additional personalities? If they prefer to remain purely Kalari? Morrison's expression grew patient, the look of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. "Commander, imagine you had lived your entire life in darkness, and someone offered you sight. Would you consider that offer an attack on your essential nature, or an enhancement of your capabilities? That's not the same thing. Isn't it? We're offering your people access to forms of consciousness and capability that they cannot currently imagine, just as sight is impossible to explain to someone who has never seen." They moved to another section of the facility, where individual integration procedures were taking place. Zexai watched through transparent walls as beings from various species underwent processes that seemed to be part medical procedure, part technological enhancement, and part something entirely outside his frame of reference. "The process is voluntary at every stage," Morrison explained. Integration begins with minor neural interface implants that allow communication with the collective consciousness network. Subjects retain full autonomy and can disconnect at any time during the first several months. "And after those months?" the neural pathways become permanently integrated. But, by that point, subjects typically find the idea of disconnection as unthinkable as you would find the idea of voluntarily severing your primary nervous system. HFY studied one particular chamber where a being that appeared to be from the lost Jing-Ti civilization was undergoing integration. The subject was conscious and appeared calm, even peaceful, as microscopic machines worked throughout their body, rebuilding neural networks and enhancing cellular structures. What happens to their memories? Their personal relationships? Their individual dreams and ambitions? Enhanced and preserved, Morrison replied. But, placed in context with the memories and dreams of thousands of other beings. Individual identity doesn't disappear, it becomes part of something larger. Captain Felross asked the question that HFY had been dreading. Have any integrated beings ever tried to warn outsiders about potential negative aspects of the process? Morrison's pause was barely perceptible, but HFY's combat-trained senses caught it. No, he replied finally. Because there are no negative aspects for beings who complete the integration successfully. And those who don't complete it successfully? Rarely survive the process, Morrison admitted. Integration requires a fundamental willingness to accept change. Beings who resist too strongly typically experience neural cascade failures. The casual mention of death as a possible outcome of refusing integration sent chills through both Zephyrian officers. HFY realized that the human's definition of voluntary might be more flexible than they had initially implied. How often do subjects experience these cascade failures? Felross asked with clinical detachment. Approximately 12% during the early integration periods. The rate has decreased significantly as we've improved our psychological preparation protocols. 12%. More than 1 in 10 beings who attempted integration died in the process. And those who survived were transformed into something that could no longer conceive of warning others about potential dangers. I need to speak with some of your integrated Kalari, HFY said. Privately, without human supervision. Morrison smiled. Of course. Though I should mention that they no longer make the distinction between human and non-human supervision. We're all part of the same collective consciousness at this point. They were led to a private chamber where 3 Kalari were waiting. As they entered, HFY immediately noticed that the Kalari greeted them with perfect Zephyrian courtesy protocols, despite no apparent prior contact with his species. Commander HFY, the lead Kalari, spoke in perfect galactic standard. I am the being who was once called Veltar. I understand you have questions about the integration process. I want to know what you've lost, HFY said bluntly. What aspects of your original identity no longer exist? The Kalari, Veltar, considered the question with an expression that seemed to reflect multiple perspectives simultaneously. I have lost the fear of death, the anxiety of uncertainty, and the isolation of individual consciousness. I have lost the limitations of single-species thinking and the prejudices that once shaped my worldview. And what have you gained? Access to the accumulated knowledge of 300 civilizations. The ability to perceive reality across 17 different sensory modalities. Consciousness that extends beyond the boundaries of this single body into a network of millions of minds. The certainty that my thoughts and experiences will survive the destruction of my individual form. Felross leaned forward. Do you ever miss being purely Kalari? Veltar's expression shifted, and, for a moment, something that might have been nostalgia flickered across their features. I remember what that limitation felt like, yes. And I understand why you might value it. But asking me if I miss being purely Kalari is like asking if you miss being an infant. The experiences of that stage of development were meaningful and necessary, but they were preparation for something greater. What if we told you that we suspected the humans were using integration to control other species? HFY asked directly. What would your response be? I would say that your suspicion reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between individual consciousness and collective intelligence, Veltar replied without hesitation. You assume that control requires external domination, but true control comes from willing participation and shared purpose. The answer was sophisticated, logical, and completely unsatisfying. Veltar was clearly intelligent and apparently sincere, but their response sounded like it had been crafted to address exactly these concerns without actually resolving them. Can you choose to oppose collective decisions? Fel Ross asked. Can you advocate for positions that conflict with human interests? I can advocate for any position that serves the long-term survival and development of our collective civilization, Veltar replied. But I cannot conceive of positions that would serve my interests while harming the collective, because I understand that my interests and the collective's interests are identical. The circular logic was perfectly constructed and completely terrifying. The integration process didn't eliminate free will, it redefined individual interests so that free will always aligned with collective goals. Zexai spent another hour asking increasingly detailed questions, but every answer reinforced the same conclusion. Integration was a one-way transformation that created beings who were genuinely happy with their new state but incapable of questioning whether that happiness was authentic or artificial. As they returned to their shuttle, Captain Fel Ross voiced what they were both thinking. They're not lying, Commander. They genuinely believe everything they're saying. But we have no way of knowing whether those beliefs are authentic or programmed. And that's the real trap, Zexai replied. We can't evaluate the process from the outside because everyone who's experienced it from the inside has been changed by it. The shuttle journey back to the fleet gave Zexai time to consider the impossible choice facing his people. The humans offered genuine survival and apparent happiness, but at the cost of transformation into something that might no longer be authentically Zephyrian. As they approached the Eternal Dominion, his communications officer intercepted a priority message from Earth Defense Command. The content was brief and, to the point, long-range sensors had detected the approaching Devourer scout ships. They would arrive in the Sol system within 4 months. The time frame for decision-making had just been compressed to a matter of weeks. Whether by design or coincidence, the Zephyrian refugees were running out of time to consider alternatives to integration. Zexai realized that the humans' greatest weapon wasn't their advanced technology or their collective consciousness. It was their patience and their ability to create situations where their offer appeared to be the only rational choice. But rationality, he was beginning to understand, might be the most dangerous trap of all. Because rational beings faced with extinction would choose transformation over death, even if that transformation meant becoming something their original selves would have found abhorrent. The question now was whether he could find a third option, one that preserved both Zephyrian survival and Zephyrian identity, before circumstances forced him to choose between existence and extinction. Time was running out, and the humans knew it. Which meant that whatever decision he made, he would have to make it soon, under pressure, without complete information, and with the knowledge that the beings offering him salvation might be the greatest threat his people had ever faced. The irony wasn't lost on him. In fleeing from one form of consumption, they might be walking directly into another. The final council meeting was different from all the others. This time, it wasn't held aboard a Zephyrian ship or a human facility, but in a neutral space, a small asteroid that had been rapidly converted into a meeting chamber by human engineering teams. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. They were literally meeting on barren ground, surrounded by the empty void that would claim them all if they made the wrong choice. Commander Zexai stood at the center of the chamber, looking at the holographic representations of his fleet captains and senior staff. Some were present in person, others attended via quantum communication links from their scattered ships. All of them wore expressions that reflected the weight of the decision they faced. The situation has become critical, he began without preamble. Our fuel reserves will be exhausted within 6 weeks. The approaching Devourer scouts will arrive in this system in less than 4 months. And our analysis of surrounding stellar regions indicates no viable alternative destinations within our operational range. Admiral Kryven, participating from her ship's bridge, spoke first. Commander, I've completed a tactical assessment of our options. We have enough firepower to take approximately 30% of the human orbital platforms before being destroyed. It wouldn't save us, but it would send a message to the galaxy about Zephyrian resolve. A message that no one would survive to deliver, Captain Fel Ross pointed out. Dead heroes serve no purpose except to salve our pride. Colonel Vexstar activated a series of data displays showing their intelligence analysis. I've been studying the humans' claims about their integrated civilizations. Every species they claim to have helped shows the same pattern: initial contact, brief negotiation period, integration acceptance, and, then, complete disappearance from galactic affairs. No integrated species has ever contacted the outside galaxy again. Because they have no reason to, countered Science Officer Theluna. If integration provides everything they need for survival and development, why would they seek external contact? Or because they're no longer capable of it, Vexstar replied grimly. Captain Morseth, head of engineering, provided the most sobering assessment. Regardless of our concerns about integration, we need to face mathematical reality. Our ships cannot be repaired with available resources, our population cannot be sustained on our remaining supplies, and we have no territory to call home. The humans are offering us continued existence. The alternatives are various forms of extinction. Zexhai had been dreading this moment for days. I've requested one final meeting with Director Chen. Before we make our decision, I want answers to questions we haven't asked yet. An hour later, Director Chen materialized in the chamber via holographic projection. Her expression was patient, sympathetic, and somehow final, as if she already knew what decision they would ultimately make. Commander Zexhai. Are you ready to discuss terms? I have questions that go beyond the terms you've offered, Zexhai replied. I want to understand what humanity really is, and what you truly want from us. Chen's projection shifted slightly, becoming more solid, more present. When she spoke again, her voice carried undertones that suggested vast depths of knowledge and experience. Very well. Ask what you need to know. What happened to the original humans? The primitives our ancestors surveyed? They became us, Chen replied simply. But not through gradual evolution. Through conscious choice to transcend biological limitations. And the alien technology you found, you said you improved upon it. What kind of improvements? For the first time in their interactions, Chen hesitated. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the chamber's walls. We learned that consciousness isn't limited to biological substrates. We learned that individual identity is just one possible configuration of intelligent awareness. And we learned that survival requires adaptation beyond anything our original species could have imagined. Admiral Kryven leaned forward. You're not human anymore, are you? We are what humanity chose to become. Biological immortality, networked consciousness, technological transcendence. We are individuals when we choose to be, and collective when circumstances require it. And you want us to make the same choice, Zexhai said. We want you to survive, Chen corrected. The method is negotiable, but only within the constraints of physical reality. Captain Felross asked the question they had all been avoiding. What happens to species that refuse integration but accept your help in relocating elsewhere? Chen's expression didn't change, but something in the projection's background shifted, as if vast intelligences were consulting with each other across impossible distances. They establish colonies in distant regions, usually beyond the current boundaries of galactic civilization. They develop according to their own cultural imperatives, with technological assistance that ensures basic survival needs. But no contact with the outside galaxy? Colonel Vexstar pressed. Contact would risk revealing their locations to hostile forces. The galaxy is not a safe place for small, independent civilizations. The implication was clear: species that refused integration were essentially exiled to the galactic periphery, cut off from the broader community of intelligent life. It was survival, but survival in isolation that was almost indistinguishable from extinction. Science Officer Theluna asked the question that got to the heart of everything. Is integration reversible? Can beings who undergo the process ever return to their original state? Chen's pause was longer this time. When she answered, her voice carried a sadness that seemed to echo across millennia. Theoretically, yes. The process could be reversed through extensive neural reconstruction. But, in practice, no integrated being has ever requested reversal. They understand too much about the benefits of collective consciousness to willingly return to the limitations of individual awareness. Because they've been programmed to think that way, Admiral Kryven accused. Because they've experienced consciousness as it could be, rather than as it was, Chen replied without defensiveness. You cannot miss a capability you've never possessed, but once you've experienced enhanced awareness, returning to limited perspective becomes unthinkable. HFY realized they had reached the core of the dilemma. Integration might preserve Zephyrian survival, but it would fundamentally alter what it meant to be Zephyrian. The beings that emerged from the process might carry Zephyrian memories and cultural knowledge, but they would no longer think, feel, or exist as Zephyrians had for millions of years. One last question, he said finally. What happens if we choose neither integration nor exile? What happens if we choose to face extinction on our own terms? Chen's expression became genuinely sorrowful. Then, we honor your choice and provide what comfort we can during your final years. Some paths lead to endings, Commander. We've learned to respect the decisions of those who choose such paths, even when we disagree with them. As the holographic projection faded, HFY looked around at his officers. Each face reflected the same grim understanding that had been building throughout their investigations. They faced three possible futures: transformation into something unprecedented, exile to the galactic periphery, or extinction through resource depletion. I need each of you to speak your preference, he said finally. Not as officers advising a commander, but as individuals choosing the future of our species. Admiral Kryben spoke first, her scarred face set with military determination. I choose honorable extinction. Better to die as Zephyrians than to live as something else. Captain Fel_Ross disagreed. I choose integration. Our cultural knowledge and scientific achievements deserve to survive, even in altered form. Colonel Vexstar chose exile. Independence and isolation is preferable to dependence on beings we cannot trust. The votes continued around the room, revealing the fundamental split within Zephyrian leadership. Some prioritized cultural purity over survival, others prioritized survival over cultural purity, and still others sought compromise positions that might not actually exist. When the last vote was counted, the result was as divided as HFY had feared: 6 officers for integration, 5 for exile, 4 for extinction, and 2 abstaining. No clear consensus, no obvious path forward, no way to make a decision that wouldn't betray the deeply held beliefs of a significant portion of their people. Commander, Captain Morseth spoke quietly, perhaps the decision shouldn't be unanimous. Perhaps each ship, each community, should choose its own path. The suggestion was both logical and devastating. They could divide the fleet, allowing each group to pursue the future that aligned with their values. Some ships could accept integration, others could seek exile, and those who preferred extinction could face their end with dignity. But it would also mean the end of the Zephyrian Empire as a unified civilization. After 2 million years of shared history, they would fragment into separate populations pursuing different definitions of survival. That may be our only option, HFY admitted. We cannot force a choice this fundamental on those who oppose it. As the council meeting ended, he realized that the humans had achieved something more sophisticated than conquest or assimilation. They had presented choices that revealed the fundamental contradictions within Zephyrian civilization itself. The decision they faced wasn't just about survival, it was about what survival meant, and whether some prices were too high to pay even for continued existence. 3 weeks later, the Zephyrian fleet divided. 7 ships chose integration and began the process of joining humanity's collective civilization. 5 ships accepted exile and departed for the galactic rim with human-provided resources and technology. 3 ships chose extinction and began final cultural ceremonies to preserve their heritage for posterity. And 2 ships, including HFY's own Eternal Dominion, chose a 4th option that no one had explicitly offered. They stayed in Earth's system but refused all forms of permanent commitment, maintaining their independence while accepting temporary sanctuary. The humans, to their credit, honored all 4 choices without judgment or coercion. They provided resources for the exiles, assisted with the cultural preservation efforts of those choosing extinction, began integration procedures for those who requested them, and offered indefinite hospitality to those who remained undecided. 6 months later, when the Devourer scouts arrived in the system, they found no trace of the Zephyrian fleet. Earth's defenses dealt with the threat so efficiently that the scouts never even detected the orbital platforms before being destroyed. Commander HFY, now serving as liaison between the independent Zephyrian remnant and their human hosts, watched the brief battle from an observation deck. The ease with which humanity eliminated the Devourers, creatures that had destroyed most of his empire, drove home the reality of their situation. They had been saved by beings whose power defied comprehension, whose motives remained partially opaque, and whose definition of help included fundamental transformation of those they assisted. Whether that salvation was worth the price would be debated by philosophers for generations to come. But, for now, it was enough that some part of Zephyrian civilization would continue to exist, even if the forms that existence took were nothing like what their ancestors could have imagined. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was ensuring that some voices from the old order would survive to contribute to whatever came next. Whether that was salvation or something else entirely remained to be seen. But it was unquestionably better than extinction. And, in the end, that might be the most profound victory of all, not just the preservation of life, but the preservation of hope that existence might lead to something greater than mere survival.